for distribution of government services. So from aspirational districts, they move to block level, where they also want to encourage state governments to start building unity malls where everybody can converge. Farmers, local producers can come there and sell their produce. So unity malls is something which they want to push. Capex outlay increased steeply by 33%. So this is the infrastructure and investment. That's the third pillar. The fourth pillar is unleashing the potential. National data governance policy for innovation and research for startups. This time around, very aggressively pushing agri startups. So at the rural level, encouraging entrepreneurship and a certain level of initiative. Financial sector, it looks at the MSME revamp schemes, getting an infusion of 9,000 crore plus into the entire corpus and strengthening what is going to be the driving force in our push to becoming a manufacturing economy or a nation too, along with services. 35,000 crore capital investment towards energy transition. Green growth is something which we are committed to, and like Mr. Kant and Paramayar were saying, sustainability is core to our growth and we need to leapfrog, take that jump, and that can be done only with youth power. So the next pillar, PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.2, to skill lakhs of youth with new age courses, on-the-job training and sector-wise skill.
Good evening, this is Brass Tacks. I'm Zakir Jacob. Pakistan is in the economic doldrums. While no neighbouring country should celebrate this, the fact remains that Pakistan brought this upon itself. It comes down to a simple fact. If you have a military-industrial complex that uses jihadis as an instrument of state power and spends tens of billions of dollars on constructing that, both against India and against Afghanistan, at some point it is going to come back to bite you. The snakes in your backyard analogy, which Hillary Clinton used from 10 years ago, is best placed to describe what Pakistan is going through right now. But the question is Pakistan learning the right lessons even today? 10 years after that comment was made and 20 years since the war on terror began, because look at what is happening right now between Afghanistan and Pakistan on their border right now. And it seems like the current government, much like its predecessors, from General Musharraf to Nawaz Sharif to the PPP regime, and of course now Shahbaz Sharif, the younger brother of Nawaz Sharif, none of them seem to have learned the most important lesson of all. That is, terror cannot be an instrument of state policy. So Pakistan is stuck in what many are calling a vicious debt cycle or a circular debt trap, which is what happens when an entity which is facing problems, it is not able to pay its debtors, it's not able to make payments to its suppliers and to its creditors. First, let's break down what was this circular debt management plan that Pakistan came up with, which the International Monetary Fund and their representatives who are currently in Pakistan rejected. Pakistan called for an increase in the circular debt to the tune of 950 billion Pakistani rupees for the current fiscal year, as against an earlier projection of 1.5 billion. Now, the government made a case for needing an additional subsidy of 675 billion Pakistani rupees, despite increasing the power tariff. Pakistan had increased the power tariff in the range of 7 Pakistani rupees per unit for the first 2 quarters of 2023 and 1.64 Pakistani rupees for the third quarter, which was from June to August. But the IMF has questioned this on how the Pakistan government calculated this additional subsidy requirement. It has asked the government to raise the power tariff to 11 to 12 rupees 50 paise per unit so that the requirement of additional subsidy can be reduced by half. Now, the IMF's review mission arrived in Islamabad earlier this week as Pakistan is looking to unlock a $7 billion bailout that has been stalled since November. Now that the IMF has called Pakistan's circular debt management plan unrealistic, The Pakistan government will make changes to that policy to try and restrict losses, particularly in the power sector. The IMF and Pakistan's Defence Ministry will also have to work out a gap on the fiscal front, after which different additional tax measures will be finalized in an upcoming mini budget. Right now, Pakistan has less than $3.2 billion in its foreign exchange reserves. That means it has just about enough money to cover 3 weeks of imports. After that, it is broke. The country has stopped issuing letters of credit, except for essential items like food and medicines and so on. Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio currently is 70%. So Pakistan's economy has taken one hit after another in the last few months. It started with the unprecedented torrential rains that happened, the floods of last year, particularly in Sindh and other parts of southern Pakistan, and then vast swathes of fields which were underwater, wiping out more than 8 million acres of crops. That caused a loss of $30 billion at the very least. The floods, in turn, triggered an acute wheat shortage. People were seen squabbling over subsidized bags of flour, some of them even chasing trucks that were carrying wheat flour. Then in January, there was a nationwide power outage which left more than 200 million people without electricity for 2 days straight. Authorities back then had claimed that the blackout was because of technical issues, but many have linked it to a massive fuel shortage in the country. And through each of these crises, the food crisis, the electricity crisis, Pakistan has managed to get help along the way. Last month, Pakistan avoided default thanks to a $3 billion lifeline that was provided by the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia, too, agreed to fund $1 billion worth of oil imports on deferred payments. But that is just not enough to finance even 1 month of Pakistan's oil import requirements. And we can't forget China, because Pakistan owes as much as $30 billion. That is about 30% of the entire external debt of Pakistan owed to one single country, and that happens to be China. In fact, Pakistan's debt to China is 3 times more than the debt that it owes to the IMF, and it is greater than the borrowings from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank put together. While the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, has helped improve Pakistan's infrastructure, it has taken the country's finances to the cleaners. Total planned investment under CPEC is pegged at $62 billion between FY 2015, when Xi Jinping first visited Pakistan and made the announcement, and FY 2030. So basically, in 15 years, the total amount spent on CPEC would be $60 billion. Out of that, a shade under $30 billion, about 27.5 or so, have been realized so far, which means more than half are yet to be realized, yet to be invested. Pakistan's also expanded its electricity generation capacity under CPEC, but now it is unable to make the payments that are required to keep this electricity supply going to independent Chinese power producers. So to try and make up for the shortfall, Pakistan has approached the IMF. There's currently a team of the IMF that's going to be there till early February. 23 times since 1958, Pakistan has approached the IMF. That in itself is a record. No other country in the history of the International Monetary Fund has approached it for monetary help, for financial aid, as many times as Pakistan has done. Pakistan has secured a $6.5 billion loan from the IMF. This was in 2019. The financial institution also gave a country of $3.9 billion till August of last year. Now, even if the IMF were to release the next tranche, which is a little over $1 billion, it will not be enough to shore up Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves. Right now at $3 billion plus, it might go up to $4 billion, but that is still not good enough, because Pakistan's external debt alone is more than that, way more than that, perhaps even 10 times more than that. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund has told the Shahbaz Sharif government to cut down on defense expenses if it wants a bailout. And here's the interesting thing. Pakistan's defense budget is 41.5% in debt servicing. 16% of its entire requirements, its entire budget, goes into defense alone. And this is excluding pensions and salaries and so on. 8.5% for development, 7.3% for subsidies, a little over 7% for federal public sector, 6% for power sector subsidies, a little over 5.75% for the civil government, 5.5% for pensions, 1% for disaster provision, and less than 1% for education, and less than 0.2% or 0.2% for health. So the priorities between health and education, which should be the priority for any government, is just about 1%. Caught between the IMF's demands and the Chinese debt trap, is Pakistan going to be the country that goes the Sri Lanka way, the latest in South Asia to do so? Both Sri Lanka and Pakistan are in serious debt because of China. Sri Lanka last July was left without food, medicines, fuel. The crisis was so severe, it triggered a public uprising, literally, and forced Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the then president, out of power. Hundreds of thousands of angry Sri Lankans ransacked the presidential palace. They forced the Rajapaksa brothers, both president and prime minister at that time, to announce their resignations. Now, a bankrupt Pakistan is staring at a similar scenario. Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif has resisted the IMF's demand to increase taxes and to slash subsidies because he's worried that this will have a negative impact on his party ahead of general elections, which are slated later this year. All right, so let me now open this up to our guests who are joining us. G. Parthasarathy is former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan. Professor Brahma Chalani, strategic affairs expert. Raymond Victory is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Kamar Chima, strategic and political analyst. And Abdul Samad Yaqoob is a senior leader of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. G. Parthasarathy, let me start with you first. Right now, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves, and I said this at the top, no neighboring country should rejoice at the kind of pain that Pakistan is going through right now. But foreign exchange reserves have dropped to just 3.2 billion, basically meaning that Pakistan has less than 3 weeks of its import bill that it can take care of in that 3.2 billion. Even if the IMF team, which is right now in Pakistan, were to reach a deal for the next tranche of $1.1 billion, that money is probably going to take anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks to reach Pakistan. So the next month and a half is absolutely critical. Pakistan could go the Sri Lanka way, could it?
Now, let me put it this way. Pakistan will have to realize, I'm sorry to be crude, but beggars can't be choosers. And that's precisely the way the international banks, the Western world, which otherwise has some fancy for the Pakistanis, and even the Chinese, everybody has been telling them, you get your thing first sorted out with the IMF. Now, Pakistan cannot please even the IMF. And all that, Shahbaz Sharif's efforts traveling all around the world, all he could secure was a $9.7 billion commitment, out of which, even China is not willing to pay out for till Pakistan falls in line. Pakistan is showing no desire to fall in line. In fact, the finance minister, Ishaq Dar, has been now talking about raising another $2 billion from the diaspora. But the diaspora is now getting money in Hawala. Why should they go by this route? They have tracked themselves into something bad. I think I would hate to see people in Pakistan starving or whatnot.
All right, I'll come back to G. Parthasarathy. We'll try and fix that audio link with him. But let me ask Professor Brahma Chalani. China happens to be Pakistan's largest bilateral creditor to the tune of $30 billion in total debt. That alone is 30%, 1/3 of Pakistan's total entire external official debt. Pakistan owes over $1 billion to Chinese IPPs for power purchases. Last December, the government agreed to repay this debt in installments, but in a move that could potentially and has displeased the IMF, in August last year, it renegotiated with the Chinese for those power agreements. But once again, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Nepal, whether it is now Pakistan, it goes on to show to you, Professor Brahma Chalani, just how much these Chinese debt traps or the financing of these massive infrastructure projects is actually a trap for many of these smaller countries, like Pakistan is now discovering and Sri Lanka did last year. They are simply not able to service just the debt component, forget about paying back the principal component?
You're absolutely right. But for this Belt and Road Initiative, of which CPEC is a major component, Pakistan wouldn't be in this mess. Pakistan is ensnared in a self-made debt trap. It's a debt trap largely of China's making. You know, the Chinese come in, they offer easy finance, they promise to build major infrastructure projects, and that's how they lure countries to join the BRI. And we're seeing from Zambia in Africa to Sri Lanka to Cambodia to a number of other countries, how countries, weak, vulnerable countries today are trapped in Chinese debt.
Yeah.
Now, the IMF is insisting on correcting structural imbalances in the Pakistani economy. Addressing those structural imbalances is going to be a process very painful for Pakistan's feudal economy that operates under the long shadow of the military. And going back to what you said, the specter of Pakistan, facing a Sri Lanka type economic meltdown is real. Even if it receives the additional credit from IMF by meeting IMF's stiff conditionalities, Pakistan's economic plight will remain grim because of the debt trap. But there's a bigger issue that centers on Pakistan, given the fact that Pakistan's economic plight provides leverage to the international community, to the creditor nations, whether it's the US, whether it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, to correct, to reform Pakistani state, to reform Pakistan's behavior. And yet we have seen time and again since last year that these important players have failed to take advantage of Pakistan's desperate need for international bailout to compel Pakistan to sever its links with state-backed terrorist groups. The Biden administration is a good example.
Okay.
It helped Pakistan last year secure an IMF bailout and then immediately unveiled a $450 million deal to modernize that bankrupt nation's F-16 fleet in order to make it more lethal against India. Look at the irony of it. On one hand, India is a very close partner of the United States. On the other hand, the Biden administration, instead of using the leverage to force Pakistan to sever its ties with terrorist groups, actually rewards Pakistan both by securing an IMF bailout for Pakistan and agreeing to modernize that country's F-16 fleet.
No, and
so if
that
you're not going to use the leverage against
precisely
Pakistan,
the problem,
how do we expect Pakistan to reform itself?
One of the conditions that the IMF
team
has laid down today in their discussions with Pakistan, and I want to ask Kamarchima this, is how can a poor country, a small country, admittedly, it's not in the top 10 in economies in the world, how can it have 20% of its GDP as part of its defense budget? You cannot justify 1 out of every 5 Pakistani rupees that's generated in that country going to just keeping the army, paying its bills, paying its weaponries, pensions, salaries, whatever it is. But, I mean, even big countries, China, India, it's in single digits as a percentage of GDP, their defense budget. Pakistan, a much smaller country with a much smaller economy, affords something like 20% of its GDP to just the defense forces. And the IMF today has said that is not on. You need to cut down your defense budget. Why does a small country need such a large army and such large amounts of money to service its army?
Well, I think there are a few answers to this. First of all, this is the prerogative of the people of the country that what they decide. Do they want to spend much money on defense or not? So this money on defense is being spent and the parliament of the Pakistan has approved that. So it is the people of the Pakistan who have the representatives in the Pakistan's National Assembly and in the upper house, in the Senate, and they decide every year one thing.
Kamarchima, let's be honest about it tonight. if you were to put that on a referendum to the people of Pakistan, who are running behind trucks for wheat, who have been through 48 hours of blackout, 200 million people have been through 48 hours of blackout. Are you seriously telling me if those same people are asked whether 20% of all their money should go to the army, they will say yes? Really?
Well, no, if you are putting it like this way, let me put it like this way. Okay, when people were dying in the streets of Delhi during the COVID crisis, so were not there wrong priorities in India when India was spending $76 billion on defense? So India was also spending $76 billion, but there were thousands and hundreds and thousands of people
India's
were dying
spend on
because of
defense
COVID in India.
as a
So don't
percentage
try
of
to tell
GDP.
us what we
Once again,
have
sir,
to do.
once again.
You show, but you can't do
India's
data.
spend on its defense as a percentage of GDP is less
It's
than
not-
5%. Once again, is
The
less than
question
5%
is why
for an
Indians got
economy which is $3 trillion. Okay,
People are not getting killed in Pakistan
Pakistan's
hunger.
spend on defense, much smaller economy,
So this is
much
the Indian
bigger
problem. This is
external
not
debt,
international community's
is
problem.
20%.
You can tell your problem, my
One
friend.
out of
This is
five
Indian problem,
Pakistani
not
rupees that
Pakistan's
is
problem.
generated in
The international
revenues
community is fine with
in
us.
that
We have-
country goes to servicing the army. Isn't that a legitimate question to ask?
the question is about the economic mismanagement in Pakistan.
Sure.
The question is Pakistan's political elite has relied on the borrowed growth. One, second, they have not had a good time of having consistent democratic transitions. Obviously, we have had dictatorships, we had democracies, and then we have had the wars. And remember, Pakistan is a country which fought, during all this Cold War, we remained engaged in war. Then war against terrorism. Before that, wars with India. So after 75 years, we have reached to this point where a country has been fighting for 75 years. So obviously, this is not sustainable.
I'll be very clear about it tonight, and I'll ask Raymond Vickery this. Pakistan as an economy would have gone bust far earlier had it not been for the war on terror and the amount of military and non-military aid that the United States gave to Pakistan looking the other way. And may I say, Raymond Vickery, continues to give to Pakistan even today. I think in the 20 years of the war on terror, that sum is in a few $billion what it has given to Pakistan in both military and non-military aid. Now that that tap has slowly but surely been turned off or is getting turned off, the chickens are coming home to roost. And that is what has happened with Pakistan. They could paper over the cracks for the last 20 years because American money, American dollars were taking care of it. But now suddenly, there is no utility for that. The chickens are coming home to roost.
Well, thanks for having me, and I congratulate you on the great lead-in analysis. I thought that it was spot on. There are a lot of chickens coming home to roost. And it's in no one's interest to see a failed state in Pakistan, allowing the Pakistan Taliban to run rampant and create further chaos. I think the United States and India have a role to play here. An essential lesson here is the debt trap, as you've indicated, from China. I have long advocated that the United States and India need to join together to provide a counterweight in terms of the Belt and Road, so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which has been the instrument of perpetrating this debt trap in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, and it'll happen in Africa and across the global south. What we need to be able to do is to get Pakistan to get its house in order and come to its senses. I think of the early 90s when I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce, and India's problem in terms of having enough foreign exchange only for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Now, India took the steps to modernize its economy, do away with the economic Raj top down. Pakistan is going to have to do the same thing. but it's not enough to rejoice in mistakes of the past. It's not enough to say that it's somebody else's problem. In fact, it is our problem. And we need to be able to move forward together to be able to have a Pakistan which is a positive force rather than the cesspool that it is right now in terms of its economy.
I don't disagree with you. The only point of disagreement is accountability needs to be fixed. I mean, if a certain policy has been followed by the military political elite in that country for the last 20 years, cutting across political lines, may I say, and that's landed them in this mess, then somebody needs to hold that political military elite to account. Let me ask Abdul Samad Yaqoob, who's a senior leader of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. The central bank chief of Pakistan, this is not an Indian assessment or an American assessment. This is the central bank chief of Pakistan who's admitted that Pakistan will have to repay $8 billion over the next 5 months. And admittedly, 5 out of those 8 billion could potentially be rolled over. But Pakistan still has the daunting task of having to pay at least $3 billion to meet its external debt obligations at a time when its foreign exchange reserves are just a little over $3 billion. I mean, you need that foreign exchange reserve to import petroleum, of course. Like India, Pakistan too is a majority oil importer, food, medicines, other essential items. You cannot have this unsustainable position where you have to pay $3 billion of servicing your debt over the next 5 months, and yet you only have $3 billion in your kitty, in your bank account, as it were.
Zaka, the current economic model of the Pakistan, or the current the way we deal the economy, I mean, this is not a sustainable model in my opinion. I mean, Pakistan is facing these two crucial economic challenges. One is the balance of payment, and second is the circular debt. Since its inception, during these 75 years, there were only 3 years that during that 3 years we didn't face the problem of this balance of payment. Currently, the situation is I mean, Pakistan is at the brink of economic collapse, and I mean, what if we averted this default? I mean, let's say Pakistan currently the circular debt is, I mean, the circular debt is hovering around 5 trillion rupees. So what if we successfully negotiate IMF and we get the $1.1 billion? What would be the next?
No, but Mr. Yaqoob, I'm sorry I'm bringing this up. Mr. Yaqoob, you know, when your party, the PTI, was ruling in Pakistan for the 3.5 years or almost 4 years that it ruled, that is when the debt of Pakistan, the external debt, as well as its budget deficit, almost skyrocketed. So from 2018 onwards, when the PTI came to power, it tried to reduce the current account deficit, but the fiscal deficit, so the 4 years that the PTI was in power, tax to GDP fell significantly, the largest budget deficits in the history of Pakistan. In fact, 78%, that is more than 3/4 of all of Pakistan's debt in the 70 plus years that it's been an independent and free country, 3/4 of its debt was accumulated in the 4 years that your party was in power. Where is the accountability for that?
Well, Zaka, what I am saying is the government comes, the government goes. But this economic challenges stays. I mean, the current account deficit, the fiscal deficit, the balance of payment issue, the circular debt, they are always there. That's why I'm saying that this current approach towards the economy is not sustainable. We have to take the unprecedented measures. I mean, we have to. I mean, I personally believe that we must cut the defense budget up to the 20%. Otherwise, we have to reform. We have to bring the reforms. The true reforms in the economy. Otherwise, this model is not sustainable.
Okay, let me ask you, Parsati. Mr. Yaqoob has sort of dismissed that by saying, you know, political parties come and go, governments come and go. While that may be the case, look, at the end of the day, I don't think any political party is better than the other in Pakistan. But the PTI bloated the budgets of Pakistan in a way that it finds itself in the sinkhole right now. Forget about, accountability for what it did in the 4 years that it was in power. There is a very good chance, G. Parsarthi, that the PTI could come back to power in elections to be held later this year.
I'm reasonably certain the way politics, and I've lived long enough in Pakistan for this, the PTI will come back. I don't give a chance in hell, given the present way things are going forward, of the present dispensation continuing. Perhaps they will hopefully learn and be from the wisdom of what has happened, and look at things seriously. I mean, there's no point in expecting, when foreign exchange resources and even China, bulk of repayments is defense spending.
Mm-hmm.
They will have to take a decision. I think there was a time when we were negotiating and moving ahead, and I think the causes for our problems should be addressed. And after all, to be honest with you, who bailed out Sri Lanka ultimately? It was India.
Correct.
And who's bailing out Nepal and just now? It's India. The Chinese build debts. They never help a country in a problem. The West and the Western banks do. But I'm sorry, that's not a part of China's record.
Okay. Let me ask Brahmacharani this, because last month, when things got really touch and go, things got really critical, Pakistan received financial help from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, totaling about $10 billion or so. It managed to avoid a default last month because of a $3 billion lifeline that was provided by the UAE. There was also a rollover of $2 billion of existing debt and new financing of $1 billion. Saudi Arabia also agreed to fund $1 billion worth of oil imports on deferred payment basis. But my point is, when push comes to shove, even countries of the so-called Organization of Islamic Countries, the OIC, with whom Pakistan seems to share some kind of a universal brotherhood, they are not able to pitch in as much as what would require to save Pakistan from this economic sort of meltdown that it finds itself in right now.
All these bailouts that Pakistan has received, whether from Saudi Arabia and the UAE or from China and from the IMF, have not helped matters because of one simple reason: the lack of accountability in Pakistan that you alluded to earlier. The civil-military relations in Pakistan are so skewed. There's a lack of accountability. Pakistan is a classical example of a state where the military dominates the core political institutions and processes and calls the shots in strategic policies. And the military's role has expanded from strategic matters to economic management. The military not only plays a dominant role in political structures and institutions, and now increasingly in economic management, but also controls the national discourse. So there is no accountability in Pakistan. The IMF may impose any kind of conditions. Unless there is a new paradigm in civil-military relations in Pakistan, all this credit from IMF and elsewhere will not rescue Pakistan. Pakistan will lurch from one crisis to the next, and this will go on endlessly. And as far as the politics in Pakistan is concerned, it has become messier because nobody can be in power without the support of the military. Imran Khan rose to power with the help of the military, especially his notorious ISI agency. Once he fell out with the military, he lost power. If he is to come back to power, he will need to build a new alliance with the military. That's the reality. The present Prime Minister Sharif is in power with the help of the military. So that is the issue in Pakistan. It's not about economic policy. It's not about how to restructure your economy. It's about civil-military relations and the lack of accountability in that country.
No, and I think it's best exemplified, and I want Kamar Shima to weigh in on this. For years now, the Americans have been saying it, India has been saying it, the countries of the Global Committee have been saying it, that Pakistan has sort of these strands with the Taliban in Afghanistan. It sort of gave it monies, it gave it logistical support. It, for whatever reason, strategic reason, tactical reason, you helped grow the Taliban, right? And today, you have its veritable cousin brothers in the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan who have declared open war on the Pakistani state. Look at what is happening on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan right now. Look at what happened in Peshawar a few days ago, the mosque attack. This is a creation of the military-industrial complex in Pakistan. And no political party, Mr. Chima, in your country, whether it is PTI or PMLN or any political party, PPP, no party wants to question this basic fundamental, as Brahma Chelani says, this lopsided civil-military relationship, which is now coming to cost you. 100 Pakistanis died in that attack in Peshawar. Not Indians, not Afghans.
I think very unfortunately, in the last 50 years, starting from the Russian invasion in Afghanistan, the discourse in Pakistan heavily remained dominant and regarding Afghanistan. We have been talking, engaging, either politically, militarily, economically, religiously. So this connection with Afghanistan is one of the reason of the present situation in Pakistan, and we kept going inside Afghanistan while the world was leaving Afghanistan, and we had no reality what is going to be the outcome. So once we used the Taliban as a leverage to engage with the Americans, and now the Taliban are using TTP as a leverage to engage with us. So I think Pakistan's Afghanistan policy has backfired because we didn't look it from a different lens.
Mr. Chima, you're not answering a very simple question. Whose creation is this TTP? It didn't sort of burst out from the heavens, right? Who created the TTP?
Let me be blunt on that. When it comes to the TTP, obviously these are the splinter groups, and then they're always supported by the foreign elements. India has also been financing and supporting TTP along with the regional partners, and that's the reality.
Mr. Chima, I mean well, right? I believe it is in Pakistan and India's interest that we have a normal bilateral relationship. I have nothing against Pakistan or Pakistanis, but when you deny reality to say, oh, India has been funding TTP and India is behind TTP,
obviously.
I mean, come on, let's wake up and smell the coffee, Mr. Chima.
We are smelling the coffee.
100 of your fellow citizens were killed in a mosque attack in Peshawar, ostensibly by this group. And who is making statements in support of this group? I mean, just look across the Durand line. I will challenge you, Mr. Chima, to find one statement from anybody of any consequence or authority here in India supporting the TTP or what they did in the Peshawar mosque attack.
This is not a job of the politicians to support it. This is the job of the Indian deep
let's be
state.
very clear tonight. I'll give Raymond Vickery the final word. Again, the Biden administration, at least the view here in India is that the Biden administration has not been hard enough on Pakistan. It needs to sort of really read out the Riot Act, not least because of this sort of duplicitous policy of allowing terror to grow on the one hand, and yet when that same terror comes to bite you, you start sort of flaying your arms at everybody else in the neighborhood. But fact of the matter is, no one wants Pakistan to collapse. And I don't think this is now in the hands of the United States or India. It really is in the hands of China. And if China so chooses, it can give sort of extensions or some kind of allowance on the debt that Pakistan owes that country. But from evidence that we have seen in Sri Lanka or in other countries, that's not how the Chinese operate.
Well, I don't think it's any question that's not how the Chinese operate. They operate to try to extend imperial China. And to rely on them is a figment of somebody's imagination. That's not going to happen. The way forward here is that, at least in the short run, the IMF standards have to be met. As one of your guests said, beggars can't be choosy. That has to be done, but it has to be coupled, as you say, with a stronger U.S. policy and, quite frankly, a more cooperative Indian policy in the entire neighborhood. India needs to step up, and the U.S. is willing to partner in this all across South Asia. And it's not enough just to say, look at how bad those people are, and it's going down the tubes, because the results of this collapse in Pakistan are really not in India's interest, not in the U.S. interest, not in the world interest.
I can't argue with that. I think if we have a neighbor who financially collapses, that's not in our interest. That's the worst thing that can happen to India. So I think it is in India's interest to make sure that Pakistan is afloat financially. But at some level, I think forget about what India wants, what the United States wants. I think the people of Pakistan, what they want is accountability for this failed policy of running with the hares and hunting with the hounds, which they've managed to do in this military political complex, which has managed to do for the last 30, 40 years. Somebody needs to stand up and question that. All right, I'm going to take a break. I want to thank all our guests. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back right on the other side, it's an exclusive conversation here on CNN News 18 with top U.S. diplomat Victoria Nuland, who is the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She now has a new American take on India buying Russian oil. When the start of this war, India was importing less than 1% of its oil requirements from Russia. Today, Russia is India's largest oil supplier.
ये बजट वंचितों को वरीयता देता है। ये बजट आज की एस्पिरेशनल सोसाइटी, गांव, गरीब, किसान, मध्यम वर्ग, सभी के सपनों को पूरा करे। मध्यम वर्ग के साथ खड़ी रहने वाली हमारी सरकार ने मध्यम वर्ग को टैक्स में बड़ी राहत दी है। इस सर्वस्पर्शी और विकसित भारत के निर्माण को गति देने वाले बजट के लिए मैं फिर एक बार निर्मला जी और उनकी पूरी टीम को बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं।
समृद्ध, समर्थ और संपन्न भारत. These were the three pillars on which India is envisioning its road ahead till 2047. But as Nirmala Sitharaman said, 7 pillars or Saptarishi. First up, inclusive development announcements for women, SC, ST, OBCs, other underprivileged groups, along with taking care of the salaried middle class, the government employees who are going to retire, pension person, senior citizens. Everybody's been spoken about. Reaching the last mile or Antyodaya, this has been a stated vision, and they want to follow the ideals of Vinoba Bhave and the likes of Deen Dayal Upadhyay and Mahatma Gandhi. So aspirational blocks program for distribution of government services. So from aspirational districts, they move to block level, where they also want to encourage state governments to start building unity malls where everybody can converge. Farmers, local producers can come there and sell their produce. So unity malls is something which they want to push. Capex outlay increased steeply by 33%. So this is the infrastructure and investment. That's the third pillar. The fourth pillar is unleashing the potential. National data governance policy for innovation and research for startups. This time around, very aggressively pushing agri startups. So at the rural level, encouraging entrepreneurship and a certain level of initiative. Financial sector, it looks at the MSME revamp schemes, getting an infusion of 9,000 crore plus into the entire corpus and strengthening what is going to be the driving force in our push to becoming a manufacturing economy or a nation too, along with services. 35,000 crore capital investment towards energy transition. Green growth is something which we are committed to, and like Mr. Kant and Paramayar were saying, sustainability is core to our growth, and we need to leapfrog, take that jump, and that can be done only with youth power. So the next pillar, PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0 to skill lakhs of youth with new age courses, on-the-job training and sector-wise skilling. And this will be also part of the entire Vishwakarma initiative, where those who are doing the hard skilled labor and work, craftsmen, they will also be encouraged. So these are the 7 pillars that Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, the finance minister, spoke about. Let's listen into a short excerpt of her 1 hour, 25-minute long budget speech.
I propose to increase the rebate limit to 7 lakh in the new tax regime, the new personal income tax regime, with 6 income slabs starting from 2.5 lakh. I propose to change the tax structure in this regime by reducing the number of slabs to 5 and increasing the tax exemption limit to 3 lakhs. The new tax rates are 0 to 3 lakh, nil. 3 to 6 lakhs, 5%. 6 to 9 lakhs, 10%. 9 to 12 lakh, 15%. 12 to 15 lakhs, 20%. And above 15 lakhs, 30%. Mahila Samman Savings Certificate will be made available for a 2-year period up to March 2025. This will offer deposit facility up to 2 lakh in the name of a woman or girls for a tenure of 2 years at fixed interest rate of 7.5% with partial withdrawal option. The maximum deposit limit for senior citizens savings scheme will be enhanced from 15 lakh to 30 lakhs of rupees. The maximum deposit limit for monthly income account scheme will be enhanced from 4.5 lakh to 9 lakh for single account and from 9 lakh to 15 lakh for joint account. Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0 will be launched to skill lakhs of youth within the next 3 years. On-job training, industry partnership and alignment of courses with needs of industry will be emphasized.
So let's quickly look at the highlights of Budget 2023 and why we say it's Sabka Budget. It's got fiscal prudence in consideration, it's got poll considerations. So there is about the vision of Bharat in 2047, but there is also the vision of the ballot in 2024 and of course the build-up in the states. We got Zaka on the wall, not with the poll numbers, but with the budget numbers this time, and we look at all of that in detail. But let's signpost some of the salient features. The growth via higher capital spending up by 33% to 10 lakh crore rupees. It surprised everybody and the corporate world has welcomed it. Focus on fiscal prudence continues. No tax on salary up to 7 lakh rupees in the new tax regime. So it's an out and out rebate if your salary is 7 lakhs. If it is more than that, then you get into the slabs which have also been revised in the new tax regime. Tax savings for young and retired continue. Nudge to the new tax regime is very clearly evident. This capex target of 10 lakh crore is very, very important because this capital expenditure is what will solve perhaps the jobs problem, ladies and gentlemen. Is everybody happy about it? We have to wait and see whether or not everybody is happy about it. What are the other allocations and some of the other sectors that have been taken?
So it's a big year for India diplomatically as it assumes the G20 presidency. A lot of variables at play, from the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, the ongoing border standoff between India and China, and of course, let's talk about all of this and more. I'm now joined by the US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Thank you, Zaka. Great to be with you.
Let's start with the biggest ongoing clash that is between Russia and Ukraine. What is the US assessment of where the war stands right now as we pull up on a year since it began? And the million-dollar question everyone's asking, how is this likely to end?
Well, Zaka, as you have said, it is almost a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has been very brutal and cruel, and not simply on the battlefield, but we also see Russia attacking civilian infrastructure throughout the winter. What they can't win on the battlefield, they're trying to win by freezing Ukrainians and cutting off the water, but Ukraine is standing strong and is fighting back hard. We and our allies and partners in the 50-some country coalition that supports Ukraine have understood that Russia could end this war any day if it stopped fighting. So if Russia stopped fighting, the war would end. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. And so, as you saw when the President and President Zelensky met in Washington in December, the Ukrainians are committed to continuing to try to fight for their land, and we are now trying to get them what they will need to launch a successful winter and spring offensive, because currently the map on the ground does not favor them.
So I'm curious to know, in this context, what the U.S. position is vis-a-vis India's stand. India's not necessarily always taken the position that Western countries have taken on this conflict, and in particular about the import of Russian oil. Russia, which was selling less than 1% of India's energy needs when before this war began, and now it's India's largest energy supplier. I'm curious to know, have you had those conversations with your Indian counterparts?
So we've been having very rich conversations with India throughout this period, including before the war began, when we were worried about it. As you know better than I, India has historic dependencies that go back to the Soviet period, particularly in the security sphere. Almost all of India's weaponry comes from Russia and the Soviet Union. Now you see, not only is Russia not going to be in a position to resupply, but the weapons aren't working too well out there. So we've been having the conversation about diversifying away from that kind of dependency, doing more with the U.S. and with other friends in the defense sector. And of course, on the energy side, India, as you know, buys on the spot market, so it always goes for the best price. So one of the things that we've been talking about before and during and after the decision on an oil price cap by many of us was that this would actually benefit India. So even though you're buying more Russian oil, the fact that you're paying cheaper prices for it is good for India, but it also dries up the revenue that would otherwise contribute to Putin's war machine. So this is where we are now. You're going to buy your oil from somewhere. What we want to ensure is that you're not fueling the war.
I started off by saying that this is India's G20 year. It's a big
big year.
Year for India. You must have seen billboards and hoardings all around town talking about the G20. The last G20 in Bali was sort of overshadowed by this war. Do you reckon in 8 months' time, when India hosts the G20, we would have been seeing the end of this war, or will that still be the dominant theme, as it were?
Zaka, if I had a crystal ball, I would love for the Ukrainian people for this conflict to be over. But I think what's more important is that as host of the G20, India has a hugely strong role to play in the message that all of the big democracies are sending to the two big autocracies that are trying to change the rules of the road by force and coercion, whether it's Russia or whether it's China. So we've been doing a lot of talking together with India as you get ready to host about the things that we need to work on together. We need to ensure resiliency in our supply chains. We need to ensure that China can't continue to indebt countries and not follow the global rules of the road there. I'm off to Sri Lanka after this. We talked about that, about our responsibilities for some of the challenges, whether it is in health. We've worked together on COVID. We're now working together on food security, which is obviously exacerbated by Russia's war on Ukraine. We have other work together to do to ensure resilient supply chains. Some of that work is being kicked off this week, in fact, by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and National Security Advisor Doval. So a lot of things that we're doing together bilaterally are also enhanced by the fact that India is chairing the G20 this year.
I want to talk about the other autocracy, as you called it. There's been this ongoing standoff between India and China for the better part of the last 2 years. What is your best understanding of why China has tried to unilaterally change the status quo?
Well, obviously we oppose any unilateral efforts to, whether it's civilian, military, to change the status quo. I'm not going to speak for why China's doing what it is doing, but obviously it would be far better to try to settle these issues at the diplomatic table. In the past, India has had some success there, and I know that you are continuing to try, and we encourage that.
Just to take that conversation forward, the Indo-Pacific, of course, is a big priority for the United States, as indeed it is for India. Where do you see the future of Quad? We're already seeing, countries like Japan, for example, which is a pacifist constitution, did not have an aggressive standing army. Now they're really thinking seriously about changing that posture. Do you see an increasing militarization of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, we're trying to do actually the opposite, Zaka. We're trying to ensure through the cooperation that we have India, Australia, Japan, US, to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, not only in our own interest, but in global interest. 50% of global trade goes through the Taiwan Straits. So the work that we do in Quad is about keeping things open, keeping them free, but it's also about advancing maritime security, it's about advancing climate goals, it's advancing food security, all of these kinds of things that the democracies need to work on together, even as the autocracies work to change the global rules of the road.
You talked about Taiwan. There is increasing concern that there could be some kind of a military flare-up between China and Taiwan. We even had recently an American general say that in 2025 there's going to be a military action between China and Taiwan. What are the conversations you're having with the Chinese and with the Taiwanese to try and avoid that situation?
As you know, Zaka, President Biden sat down with President Xi Jinping last autumn in Bali to try to talk president to president about our responsibilities as big powers to maintain peace, to maintain stability, about the fact that, our One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act together have kept the peace, have been a status quo situation that has helped us all avoid conflict for decades and decades and decades, and that if there is an effort to change that status quo now, and particularly by force, we're all going to suffer. So that's a conversation the presidents have had. We will now continue it in other channels with the Chinese. What we want is to ensure that we have crisis management release valves, that we can talk to each other as necessary, but we also want to reaffirm that the status quo has kept the peace, and to change that now is not good for China, it's not good for anybody, and it's certainly not good for global peace.
Last couple of questions. Let's talk a little bit about India's western neighbor, Pakistan. There is a massive economic crisis that's going on there. The IMF team, even as we speak, will be there for the next couple of weeks. What is your best assessment, again, of the financial situation there in that country, and what would the United States ideally like in terms of the India-Pakistan bilateral itself? Things have been far from normal for a while now.
Well, first and foremost, as you said, even before the massive floods, which put something like a third of Pakistani territory underwater, the financial balance wasn't good in Pakistan. So we have favored their intensive conversations with the IMF. As you know, the IMF is not a pushover, so there are some tough decisions that the Pakistanis need to make, but certainly it's in the interest of their people, recovery from the flood, the entire neighborhood, if the IMF can reach agreement with Pakistan. With regard to Pakistan and India, we have strong relations with both countries. From where we are sitting, whenever India and Pakistan can talk, it's a good thing, and we continue to encourage that.
All right, and one final word. Does the United States have any concerns on freedom of religious practices here in India, persecution of minorities? Could you give us a sense of what your conversations with your Indian counterparts are in that regard, if at all you have any concerns?
I would say, Zaka, that as democracies and as the world's biggest democracies, we all, both in America and in India, we have a responsibility to protect the values and the rights that come with that, including religious freedom for all. We struggle with that at home. And, you know, there are days when there are challenges for all of us. So we always have that conversation about how we can protect the democratic underpinnings that make us who we are and separate us from other kinds of governments where at least I would not want my children to grow up. And I'm going to guess the same is true for you.
All right, it indeed is. Thank you very much, Undersecretary Victoria Nuland, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Zaka. Appreciate it.
Horizon. So they're looking beyond Lok Sabha 2024, and the Prime Minister very, very clearly said a Samriddha, Samarth and Sampanna Bharat. That's the vision for 2047. So let's try and break up what stands out for you and me, the salaried class, ladies and gentlemen. The highlight is tax mein kuch bachega ke liye, tax mein kuch bachega liye. For 2 years, nothing happened, Zaka. But this time, big bang announcements.
Yeah, I think for the middle class, absolutely, it is the tax numbers that everybody is crunching. They're looking at the new tax regime. First of all, the big picture, the new tax regime up until last year had 7 slabs. She's now slashed that down to 5. So it's an important thing. The big announcement, of course, is that if you have an income, like Anand was saying, up to 7 lakh rupees, then you pay no income tax whatsoever. Anything above 7 lakhs, then this is the new tax regime. These are the rates as per which you will be paying your tax. So let's assume you have an income of 8 lakh rupees, which means for the first 3 lakh rupees, you will not be paying any income tax. Between 3 lakh and 6 lakh rupees, that's 3 lakh rupees, you will pay 5%, that's 15,000 rupees. And then for the remaining 6 lakh to 8 lakh, which is 2 lakh rupees, you will pay at 10%.
Hello, Namaskar. This is First Post and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Tonight we have news from the neighborhood. Pakistan is broke and buried under debt, seeking a bailout but refusing to mend its ways. It's a story of many parts and a lesson on how not to run a country. Meanwhile, India's Prime Minister is preparing for a state visit to the US. In Europe, hundreds of thousands of people are out on the streets. British Home Secretary is telling the police to arrest the protesters instead of posing for photos with them. In the age of social media, can you really blame the cops? In Singapore, the blame game in jilted love has reached a court. And trust me,